Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we're going to talk about topics for part 3. So let's go. Okay, so I wanted to make this video because I wanted to lay out the kind of topics that you're likely to be tested on at your part 3. There are two places I've touched on in the past that can give you a little bit of a pointer for your part 3 as well. So the first of those is this, the RIBA job book. Obviously not this one, the new one, this is the old one, but basically that gives you the breakdown of how a job is run sort of as an exemplar in the UK. And so knowing the process the job goes through will help you with most of the kind of questions at part 3 because you'll understand what needs to be done to get a project to completion. The part 3 is testing you specifically more on the how you go about things as an architect, so the legal system in which you operate and the requirements of being an architect in the UK, which again we've touched on in things like the ARB video. One of the things that's super useful, and this video is technically to help you fill out PDR, but it's also to help you formulate your vision for part 3. But if you check out the video I did on part 3 criteria from the ARB, this is literally what you get marked against for your part 3. So it's literally telling you everything that they want you to understand in order to pass it. So that is the best thing that you can really look at to help you formulate your revision. And if it speaks about something that you don't know, then that's a great thing to then go and look up, ask about in your practice or get experience of directly. But today what I've tried to do is break it into some more simple header topics with some specific little topics underneath. I'm just going to run through them really quickly. Hopefully they help you a little bit in just understanding what kind of topics you should maybe look at, or help you formulate what you could discuss in your study groups as well if you are doing part 3 study groups, which you totally should. If you don't have one, they're brilliant, especially find people with different experience to you. You can learn loads. So I have broken it down into 5 topics, and I'm just going to run through each of them using a handy graphic. But the 5 topics themselves are the early stages, design, planning, building regs, and construction. These are the major things that part 3 is concerning. As I say again, I'm just going to say it all the time, this isn't everything that you might be tested on because you'll be tested on anything an architect does, but that's the kind of main headers, and I'm just going to tell you what topics I've put under each header in a quite sort of broad way, and then under those is a load more detail which we're not going to go into now. If you would like any other videos on more specific topics, let me know in the comments below and I will try and do that for you. So early stages, what does this consider? This is early stages of a project, but also early stages of a business technically, because if you pass your part 3, then you could then be an architect with your own business using the title architect the same as any other architectural practice. So the part 3 doesn't only test you on the way to do a job day to day, but it's also testing you on the background of that. So what's your business setup? You need to know the difference between different kinds of businesses in the UK, like sole traders, but don't be a sole trader, partnerships, limited companies, and what the kind of legal framework is for each of those and the requirements of each of those. Also in here, I would put things like the ARB itself, what it means and what it means to be an architect in the UK, and other and their code of conduct as well, and then other systems like the RIBA and their code of conduct and how those two bodies are different to each other. This looks at practice management as well, so like I say, it's running a business, but it's also like the management of that practice and its potential employees, and anything that might be considered under that, so like things like discrimination or like wages or I don't know, literally anything. So you're not only being tested on being an architect day to day, but also being a business person, and it's probably the thing you're taught least at ready for part 3, so it's really something to be aware of. Under that also comes insurance massively. One of the key factors throughout part 3 is your approach to risk, and we'll mention it a little bit more at the end of the list. But insurance, particularly professional indemnity insurance, which architects are required to have, you need to understand what that is and what it means. Also the business cash flow itself, so how you keep a business alive, how you're paying yourself and others, what are your overheads, what's your turnover, what's your profit, all those kind of things you need to understand too. And under that is kind of resources and programming. So you need to understand how to resource a job and to make sure that you can complete a job within a required timescale. Time management is something that architects, again, not massively keen on, especially from the way you're taught at university, but you need to understand how to do that in order to have a successful business. And then a little bit more specifically, the early stages of a project itself, by this we mainly mean the architect's appointment. It's referred to as the architect's appointment, but essentially it's just contract. It's a contract situation with the client, and really it's just subject to contract law. But you need to know what an architect's appointment is, what it needs to include, and standard forms for it as well, such as the RIBAs, but there are others, and what it means to have it, what it needs to have in it, and also things that often come up in the architect's appointment. So dispute resolution is there, we'll mention that again later as well, but other things like copyright law too, they often come up in part 3 that you get tested on. That's kind of whirlwind list, I cannot speak today, of early stages. These are topics that might come up. They're things that you should be aware of. You need to understand what it means to run a business, especially an architectural business, and you also need to understand what it means to start and undertake a contract with a client. Okay, number 2 is design. Design is very small in part 3. So as an architect being trained in the UK, the majority of your design education is in part 1 and part 2, and a lot of the time you're probably thinking all your education is design based. So then part 3 suddenly flips it, and you're learning very dry, I like it, but very dry stuff, mainly legal based, mainly processes based of how you actually undertake that job. But obviously it's of equal importance, because if you can't build a great design, then it kind of doesn't really matter. So under design, I've only put 2 things, and that is contract changes. So essentially, by doing a great design, you need to be aware again of the programming and resourcing of that design, and the fees for that design, and what it means if the client decides to change that design or wants adjustments. What does it mean for the contract, and what does it mean for your business? These are quite common sense things, but how does that knock-on effect happen, and what needs to be done in order to do it under the proper processes? And the other is CDM, so construction design management, and principal designer, and what it means to be a principal designer, which is often an architect's role, especially now. So it's understanding those regulations and showing that you understand how they start from the inception of a project. Number 3 is planning. And planning is a massive topic in your part 3, because it's kind of the first time that you're coming across the legal regulatory framework situation that's out with an architect's job itself. So under planning, I mean, it's also kind of like PC3 of the ARB's criteria, which is legal framework and processes. I'll also put on these, or well, I've started to put on these, you'll have seen it already, but I haven't seen it already. I'll put on how these relate to some of the professional criteria from the ARB. But planning, so what's that broken down into? So pre-planning applications, what they are, what that means, what the process is, permitted development, and then also lawful development certificate. I'm putting those together just because they're often together, but not necessarily. Outline planning consent, listed building consent, homeowner planning consent, full planning consent, reserved matters, prior approvals, removal or variation of conditions, discharge of conditions, which also means approval of conditions, consent under the preservation orders, ecology investigations that are required for planning applications often, which is like looking into the presence of bats, owls, newts, etc. Then some certain designations like SSSI, which is Site of Special Scientific Interest. Greenbelt also is a designation with specific planning rules around it. Things like the Section 106 agreement, it's a standard planning legal enforcement and what it means and what they can do with it. Also SILs, which means Community Infrastructure Levy, what a SIL is and what it means and why they're used. Also, you need to understand sort of the legal systems of the UK, land law, property law, especially things like easements, which is allowing access over land or sites. You need to be aware of all of these so you can properly advise your client. And then also the appeals process, so what it means to go to the planning inspector if you have your planning application refused, the whole process from beginning to end of planning permissions in the UK and everything that they can kind of possibly involve. You need to have a general awareness of most of them and also of the kind of most common ones, such as like pre-planning, outline consent and full planning consent. But you need to know about listed buildings as well and pretty much everything I've listed there. So planning, major topic. Miniature story for my own part 3, one of the great people in my study group had never done planning because that wasn't the kind of role she did. She built out data centres. So she taught me about like practice management and stuff from a massive practice perspective, and I taught her about planning because it's something that I had done a lot of in my previous small practice up north. So it depends on what kind of skills you've got. That's why a study group's so great, because you can know people who've been in certain kinds of practice for a long time and basically understand their knowledge and you can give them your knowledge. So that's a great idea, but also planning, major topic. Number 4, building regs. So this comes after planning because it does come after planning in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. If you're talking about building warrants in Scotland, then that's a different situation, and we're going to ignore Scottish systems for the moment, even though I was taught in both. So building regs is a similar legal framework system to planning, but for a different purpose. You need to understand what the building regulations are, the actual legislation, and also what the approved documents are, and understand that they're not the same thing. You need to understand the responsibilities of when approval is needed, including approval that you might not have thought you need for things that are kind of relatively small changes to existing homes. You need to know whether you would go with a local authority building inspector or an approved inspector, and what the difference is between those two, and what the implications would potentially be to your client to picking either one of them. And then also under this topic, I put HSE notification. So HSE is the Health and Safety Executive, and an F10 is the form that you notify them of construction beginning on a site, basically so that they can be aware that there is obviously construction, inherently a dangerous thing going on. But obviously, because we've already mentioned it, CDM would be in place, and CDM is continued through all of the stages until completion of a building. So that's kind of building regs. Okay, and lastly, guys, number 5, construction. So when you're going to construction, what do you start with? Tendering. You need to be aware of tendering and what the general rules are in the UK around tendering and how they're different, because it depends on the building project and the size of it as to what rules apply. And then you need to also be able to advise your client on the correct route of procurement for that building. So that essentially means which contract it would be built under. And Which Contract is a great book to help you with that, to understand different procurement methods so that you can understand the different effects of them and therefore advise your client on the most appropriate one for them. So 2 major examples of those, but there is more, is traditional and design and build. And maybe we'll do a particular video just on contract types, but they're the 2 main ones. And then the provider of the contract, so JCT, NEC, the RIBA also do their own construction contracts as well. You need to understand those kind of providers, differences between the types of contract, what you would advise people to do, and what the responsibilities of the architect are under those. So on a traditional contract, contract administrator is a role that an architect sort of traditionally inhabits. You need to understand what the requirements of a contract administrator are and what they do. Often traditional contracts are tested at part 3. They're not necessarily the norm in the majority of construction anymore, but they are a traditional architect's role and therefore you're tested on them. And then also design and build being the other major type of contract. What's the architect's role on that and how is it different? Which brings up words like novation and what that means. And I'm not going to tell you any of these things, I'm just going to list them out. So that's something else you need to look at. And design responsibilities under those contracts, where they fall and what the situation is. One way that which contract breaks down, which contract to pick, that's really helpful is how risk is apportioned between the parties of the contract, which is mainly the client and the contractor, sometimes the contract administrator as well, or designer. And then also how the different contracts have an effect on time, cost and quality, so that kind of trifactor. They're really great ways of assessing which contract is most appropriate, but which contract gives you really good advice on that. And if you want a more specific video on contract types and stuff, say in the comments and I will try and do that. And so then also third-party rights and how they come into contracts, things like collateral warranties, what they are, what they do, and actually just understanding what that is, which can take a bit of time to get your head around if it's just something you've never done or you've never seen. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier in terms of an architect's appointment, also in a construction contract, both different contracts, but they're both subject to contract law, obviously, is dispute resolution. They can include like mediation, arbitration, litigation, etc. So understanding the different kinds of dispute resolution and what they mean is also critical for your part 3. So they're my 5 topics, guys, and the major 5 headers, let's say, and major topics underneath all of them. Again, not expected to cover everything because I'm going to try and make a short video-ish for once in my life. I mean, it's not going to happen, but you're here now, so thank you for still watching. And like I say, there's literally nothing better to look at than this. I will put the link for it below in the description. Check that you understand pretty much everything that it's talking about. If there is something you specifically want a video on, because you don't, drop it in the comments below. And thank you for watching. Thank you guys for subscribing. We have way too many subscribers now. It's nearing 100 people. I know that sounds mental, but that's kind of crazy to me. But yeah, all we want is for any of these videos to be a little bit helpful in your journey to being an architect, and it is fun. I know this sounds like boring stuff, but I mean, the reason I'm talking about it is I don't find it boring, but clearly I'm mental. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. Have a great day wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. It's the point.